Okay, so this week's parsha, Beha'alotcha, when you elevate, which means when you light the candles, is a parsha that is really about a lot of transition happens. For the first time, the Jewish people are going to leave Mount Sinai. They left Egypt, and then about 6 weeks later, a little bit more than 6 weeks later, they came to Sinai, and they were at Sinai for almost a full year. During that year, they got the Torah. They made the golden calf. They got the second tablets. They made the tabernacle. And in the beginning of the fourth book, we read about how they would organize the preparation to travel. And now they're ready to travel. Um, and everything is looks very optimistic and very organized. We spent two portions last week and the week before talking about how they were Jewish people are organized for their travels. And finally, in the beginning of this parsha, we read about a few commandments about the menorah, which we can get to, and then they finally they journey away from Sinai, and it doesn't take a long time. It takes one or two verses, and all of a sudden, the debacle happens. The Jewish people start complaining about everything, and story after story from here is basically downhill, and until you get to the real devastating story, which is next week, which is the story of the spies and the sin of the spies, which caused the Jewish people to remain in Israel, in the desert for another 40 years. And that generation was banned from the land of Israel. Only the next generation, the children, were allowed to go into the land of Israel. So there's a lot of um, plot in this parsha, but there's also a lot of disappointment and dealing with disappointment and question about how do I deal with disappointment why does this happen? And the person who's most disappointed of all, of course, is Moshe. And we read some very, 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 I would say beautiful. It's beautiful, but it's also very sad, very lonely verses where Moshe basically he can't handle the people anymore. Even though he's been loyal to them before, and every time they sinned, he wasn't deterred. He was their advocate and the defendant. I'm sorry, defended them. And but here it's almost like a breakdown. And to the extent that God says, "Oh, okay, you can't do it alone," Moshe says, "I can't do it alone." Okay, so we'll have 70 people to help you, and he appoints 70 elders to help Moshe. Um, so there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of pain, and the question, of course, is what is the what's really happening? What's the backstory? And also, what is the Kabbalistic story? Right? So we're sitting here today and say, what are the real struggles? What's Moshe really struggling with? And what are the people struggling with? And how do we move forward in this imperfect world? So that is by way of introduction about just sort of bringing the parsha and then figuring out where we want to orient and where we want to where we want what we want to focus on. Um, I'll just say that we know there are five books of Moses, but there's a medrash that says that there are actually seven books. It's based on a verse that says that the Torah has seven pillars. So there's seven books of the Torah. How do the seven books of the Torah? We only know about five. So the fourth book becomes three books. And the midpoint is in this week's Parsha. In other words, in this week's Parsha, there is when the Jewish people journey from Sinai, the Torah describes what the Jewish people said. And it's actually a very famous verse because we say it every time we open the ark. Vahi bin Aaron, and it happened when the ark journeyed. And it's very interesting because the liturgy that we have today is all basically all rabbinic, but some things go back really to the Torah. The Shema goes back to the Torah, and this statement that we say when we take the ark out, the Torah out of the ark, we say when the ark traveled, and the Jewish people would say whatever they said, that Hashem rise and that the enemies disperse, whatever the case is. So the point is, there are two verses that describe when the ark traveled, because that was the first time the ark traveled. And in the Torah, if you get that reading, if you get called up to that reading, you will see something interesting that in the actual text of the Torah, this paragraph, it's a short paragraph, it's two verses that discuss what the Jewish people said when the ark traveled. It's its own paragraph, but also, even though there is no vowels or punctuation in the actual text of the Torah, here there's something unique. This portion is surrounded by two upside down letters, the nun upside down, and it's just what is it doing there? Nobody knows. So somehow or another, it's saying this is a break. There's a break here. And let me see if I can actually find it so I can show it to you. But what that tells you, according to the Medrash, is there are three books. There's up to these two verses, there's these two verses, and then after that. What is that really telling us? Give me just one moment. Let's see if we get a visual. That will make it easier to see. Um, yeah, looks like we can get a visual here. If I can figure this out. No, I don't want the video. What is going on this page? Okay, here it is. Um, Apologize for the delay. How do I share this screen? Okay, so this is this week's top parsha. You see the Torah has no punctuation of vowels. And then you hear this paragraph, Vayibin Sa Haaron, when the ark would journey, and Moshe said, may God arise, may his enemies be dispersed, and those who hate you should flee from before you. That's what we say when we open the ark every Shabbat and Monday and Thursday. When the ark rested, they would say, Shuva Hashem, return God, the God of the myriads of the thousands of the Jewish people. Okay, but what you see here is there's an upside down nun on both sides. Very unusual in the Torah, but right here it is. So that's why the Medrash says there's seven books of the Torah. The fourth book is really three books up to this point from this actual verse of the Torah traveling, and then after this point. And in some ways, yeah, because up to this time, everything is very organized. The Jewish people, more or less, ever since the sin of the golden calf, but more or less, they recuperated from that and they're organized around the ark. But once they start traveling, they start complaining immediately. Right after that, the people were complaining. What were they complaining about? We're not even sure. It doesn't really matter. They found something to complain about. And then they complain they want meat. And then they say, take us back to Israel, to Egypt. It doesn't stop. Okay. But what's the broader point? What's broader point is happening here. What is really happening between these three verses? Between these three, there's before the ark traveling and after the ark traveling. One way to think about this, if you want to generalize, there is the picture, there's the ideal life, which is always more organized than there are no missing books. No, there are no missing books. There are additional books. In other words, you can categorize it as five books of the Torah. Or you can, yeah, correct. No missing books. We're talking about the same five. The same five are really seven. If you break it down, you divide the fourth book into three, and you end up with seven. And the point is just to show that this break is so important that the Torah actually puts a letter, a nun, upside down nun before and after, which is very unusual to say this is its own thing. Okay. But what's really happening here? What's really happening here is that there's a difference between the ideal and the practical. In the ideal world, when you're preparing, when you're studying, when you're thinking, everything is organized, everything is perfect. But the moment you try to apply it to the real world, it's always more messy. Think about this case in point. They had to go to Israel. Going to Israel seems like a straightforward proposition. God is helping you, you move forward, you go. That's in the ideal world. In the practical world, it takes 40 years. And the practical world is much more messy and much more complicated than it is in the ideal. And that's why Torah makes a distinction. There's the ideal, there's the practical. Now, knowing about this helps us, first of all, not be disappointed. You have this ideal what my life is going to look like, what my marriage is going to look like, what my parenting is going to look like. And 100% of the time, it's not going to look out. It's definitely not going to look the way you thought it's going to look, because in your mind, it's all theoretical. And the real world is there are challenges and there are difficulties and there are tensions that have to be resolved. And the end product may be better, but it's going to be different. And it's not going to be as clean and it's not going to be as neat. So that's what's happening in this parsha. So maybe the first teaching is not to be disappointed and not to be discouraged by real life, because real life is more complicated and more messy. And so that's I think a very important introduction just to the human insight and the psyche of the human being. And in a way, that's what's happening to Moshe. So let's think about Moshe. Okay, let's go even before Moshe. The people have a series of complaints. Now the question is, would a complaint, why do people complain? So you could say people complain because it's difficult, but that's not always the case. And arguably, the difficulty is not the cause of the complaint. And also the fact that next week's parsha, they don't want to go to the land of Israel because they're afraid, that also could be surface. So what I'm trying to say is like this. What do they complain about? If you open up the parsha right when they start complaining, it doesn't say what they complained for. It just says, "Vayia am kimitonim," the people who complained. It doesn't say what they complained about. And later, a few verses later, it talks about other complaints, and every other time the Torah is very clear in telling you what they complained about. But the first time when they complain, it doesn't say what they complained about. And maybe that's the message. Maybe that's the whole teaching. The whole point is that it doesn't matter what they're going to complain about. If what the complaint is. If a person is in a state of complaining, and we'll talk about what that is, they are going to complain about everything. It doesn't matter what you do for them; they're still going to complain. So the Torah, by not articulating what the reason for the complaint is telling you the reason doesn't matter. If you want to say why am I complaining and how am I going to solve my complaint, you have to look deeper than what the specific complaint is about. So the Medrash says that the Jewish people, when they traveled away from Sinai, the Medrash says that the way it's written in a way of with a voice that sounds like it's negative. What's negative? They're going to Israel. So the Medrash says that it was like a child running away from school. In other words, for them, Sinai was the place you get the Torah. And at this point, for whatever reason, the Jewish people are very happy to leave Sinai. And the Medrash seems to be saying that that is the origin of all the problems that are to follow. And ultimately, that was the late 20 years, is because they're running away from the Torah. They're running away from study. They're running away from the Torah. But what's really happening here? What's really happening here, perhaps you could say as follows. All the complaints start when a person does not value what they have. So if the Jewish people don't value what they have, then the challenges and the commitment is going to cause complaints because everything takes effort, everything takes investment. But the way to alleviate it. But if I don't appreciate what I have, I'm going to complain. And if I don't appreciate what I have, then I'm not going to want to put in the effort that it takes to implement my blessing and my potential. So I'm not going to want to go to Israel because there are difficulties. But it's not because we could talk about this next week less also that it's not because the difficulties per se. It's because I don't want to invest in those. I don't want to invest despite the difficulties because the deeper problem is I'm not appreciating what I have. And maybe that's the first lesson is that when a person appreciates what they have, and it's not going to be perfect because we're not in the first part of the fourth book where everything is organized and everything is perfect because everything is theoretical. But in this world, everything is much more complicated. And then the way to move forward and have the courage and have the strength to accomplish and to move forward despite the challenges and despite the difficulties, the number one step is stop complaining. But how do I stop complaining? How do I stop complaining is by valuing what I have and not trying to run away from the blessing that I have because I take it for granted. So that is, I think, introduction a little bit about from the psychological perspective. And now we can go into the portion of what really upset Moshe and maybe different ways to read that story. And specifically, I want to speak about the Kabbalistic, but before the Kabbalistic, we can also talk a minute or two about more of the psychological perspective. So this is to set us up. If anyone has any questions or comments, please jump in. Otherwise, we continue on the journey. In the meantime, I'll open up the verses because the verses are very, very beautiful today. Okay, what happens is like this. What happens is that the people complain, and then the mixed multitudes among them had begun to have strong cravings. The Israelites too were affected and began to cry. They said, "Who will feed us meat?" Miyachalenu basar, they want meat. And they say the famous verse, we recall the fish that we ate in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the watermelons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now we are bored. There is nothing else at all. We have nothing before our eyes but manna. And the Torah goes and talks about a plug, how great manna was, but we're not going to talk about that. Moshe is devastated. And Moshe basically says, I don't love this translation, but we'll go with it. Why not? Moses said to God, "Why have you treated me, your servant, so badly? Why have I not found favor in your regard that you place the burden of this entire people upon me? Did I conceive this entire people? Did I give birth to them? That you say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nursing woman carries a suckling to the land you promised their forefathers? Where can I get meat to give all these people? For they are crying to me, saying, give us meat to eat. I cannot carry this responsibility of this entire people alone, for it is too hard for me. And then he says, if this is the way you want to treat me, please kill me first, if I have found favor in your regard, so that I not see my evil. So basically, people asked for meat, and Moshe says he loses it. He says, I can't handle them. I'm not their mother. I can't handle them. I don't have any meat to give them. Please kill me. And in a way, Moshe is right. He can't handle them because what does God respond? God says, you know what? God doesn't respond. God just says, gather for me 70 men from elders of Israel, whom you know were the people's elders and foremen in Egypt. You must take them to the tent of meeting, and they must stand there with you. I will descend to speak with you there, and I will increase some of the spirit that is upon you and bestow it upon them. They must bear the burden of the people together with you, so that you need not bear it alone. And then God says, we're going to bring slav, we're going to bring the birds that they'll be able to have their meat. So in a way, Moshe is right. Moshe says, God, I cannot handle this alone. And God says, okay. God says, I'm going to appoint 70 people. But this story is very problematic because why does Moshe can't, what's worse? This is not the worst sin that the Jewish people committed, asking for a little bit of meat. Um, the people served idols in the past. The people rejected the land of Israel in the future, and they were no less than perfect in all these stories. And this is the only story where Moshe cannot handle the requests. He simply cannot handle it and breaks down. And in a way, God says, you know, you can't really do it. We're going to get somebody else to help you. So the question is, what's so offensive about this request that I want a little bit of meat? So there's two ways to think about this. The practical way, we'll start with the practical way, and we go to the Kabbalistic way, which is really where we really wanted to start with, but we have to set up the parsha. So the practical way is this, in a way, is actually much worse than serving idols. Why? Because the mistake of idols is a spiritual mistake. A person is looking for a spiritual connection. A person is looking to connect to something greater than self. But the mistake of the idol worshiper is that you look in the wrong place. Instead of serving God, he serves the idol. But what the person is looking for, there's nothing wrong with what they're looking for. Moshe is a teacher. Moshe is in the world of ideas. Moshe is for already, since he took the Jewish people out of Egypt, they came to eat, they came to Sinai, and already a year they're studying Torah and they're cultivating a relationship with God. And in his mind, he's being successful in imparting a spiritual connection, a spiritual life for the people. And then when it comes to the moment of truth, the moment they move, and the moment you find out what do they really want, where are they going to go? What do they say? They say, we want meat. Now, there's nothing wrong with eating meat, but it means, from Moshe's perspective, that they're completely out of touch because they don't have, their desires aren't spiritual desires. They just want something physical. So it's like whatever Moshe was teaching them up to this point is not taking hold. He's talking to the wall. And then Moshe feels more than anything else, he says he feels alone. He says, there's nobody else here with me. I'm talking to myself. There's nobody else that's on the same page as me. So that breaks Moshe, not because the sin is bad, but it's because everything he has been trying to teach is something that is something to raise the person to become more spiritual, and then he feels that they actually don't have it. And what does God respond? You're not alone. There's 70 people that could help. And later Moshe also transitions because at the end of the parsha he says, all Jews should be prophets. So Moshe comes to the realization that it's not all black and white. Just like we talked about, that there's the ideal world and then there's a practical world, and the practical world never looks the way the ideal world works. Just because people want meat, it doesn't mean they're not listening to Moshe. So that it takes Moshe the process it takes Moshe some time to get there because Moshe is in a way very removed from physical life. And he doesn't understand the craving for meat. He understands the craving for idol worship, because that's a spiritual mistake. But the craving for meat, he doesn't understand. He says, I can't communicate with these people. And then through the process of this parsha, Moshe realizes that it's not as bad, and it's not as bad as he initially thought. Everything is good. You can take it easy. In other words, relax. People are human. People can want meat. They can also have a connection to God, and that's the real world. And one is not. It doesn't mean that because somebody wants meat, it means they're not internalizing the lesson, the message of the Torah. That's not the case. So that's, I think, the practical way. And then we could start talking about this from the spiritual way and think about what meat represents, what Moshe represents, what Aaron represents, what lighting the menorah represents, because all basically we have to rearrange all the ingredients of the parsha and see it the same things I said earlier, but seeing from a little deeper point and sort of more Kabbalistic terminology. So that is the pitch. That's the introduction. Now that we're almost half an hour in, that's the introduction. If anybody has any comments, please share. Otherwise, we move to the Hasidic and Kabbalistic angle. Okay, so if you want to start thinking about the story from the perspective of the Hasidic, the Kabbalistic perspective, so what the Kabbalah would usually do is zoom out and give the big ideas of what are the ingredients, what are the big ideas that we're talking about here, and then um, we're going to think about how this applies to this specific story. So, excuse me for a few minutes. We're going to think about more abstract concepts, more general concepts, not directly related to this parsha. So the first thing we want to think about, if you want to think about eating the meat, and what does it mean that the people want meat and Moshe doesn't know what to do about the request for meat? You really want to think about the concept of eating in general. How does the Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism look at the concept of eating? And eating is basically a relationship with the world, because eating is the person has to intake the food of the world, and says what happens to the food, what happens to the person when they eat. And broader, if you want to go even more, even broaden the conversation, there's the food that the human being eats. There's also what the Talmud refers to as the eating of the altar, because the Mizbeach, the altar, eats the meat of the offerings. And we had in last week's parsha a great length, is a great discussion, a long discussion about the offerings that the priests, I'm sorry, that the Nisim, the leaders of the tribes, offered for the inauguration of the altar, of the temple and the altar. And every day, first 12 days, every day, one of the Nisim, one of the chiefs of the tribes, would offer their offerings, and it's listed at great length. So we're just coming from a great discussion about the offerings. There's the Medrash at the beginning of this parsha that says that Aaron was saddened that he and his tribe were not involved in that gifting the gifts for the inauguration of a temple, and Aaron feels bad, and God tells Aaron, well, that's why God reiterates to Aaron that he's going to be lighting the temple and the menorah, which is the opening statement of this week's parsha. And so we want to think about what is eating, what is the eating of the altar eating, what's the point of putting meat on the altar, burning certain parts of the animal on the altar, and then how does that compare to what Aaron does, which is supposed to be greater, as Aaron's lighting the menorah, and how does that all tie into Moshe, and how does that all tie into everything here that we're talking about? So that's really that's where we're trying to head to. So the first thing you want to think about food is that food is, on one hand, there's a hierarchy. So the irony of eating is that there's a hierarchy. The person could eat the higher you are in the food chain, you eat the things that are lower. So that, in some sense, that represents the fact that the human being is sort of higher on the food chain. So in some sense, greater than the lower forms of life. But Ironically, it also means the opposite. It means that the lower forms of life can contribute to the person. In other words, when I'm eating this piece of lettuce, on one hand, I'm elevating the lettuce and I'm making it human. And in some ways, I'm also making it godly because when I eat it and then I take that energy, I do a mitzvah, I do a good deed. Now that energy that used to be a vegetable became a human, and now the vegetable and the human become godly when I use that energy to do something good. So in the Kabbalah, there's a lot about this in the Hasidic writing. It's called the process of refining. Everything has a spark. Everything has a divine spark. And when I consume that food, but it's really not just food, it's really any physical activity. I'm taking something that's a lower form of life, a lower degree of holiness, and I am elevating it. I'm bringing it closer to God because I'm making it human. And more importantly, I'm taking the human, making the human divine when I do something good, when I do a mitzvah with that process. So, in a way, the process of eating is the process of elevation. We think about eating sometimes as just a biological need. I have to eat to survive. Okay, I'll also eat for pleasure. If I have to eat to survive, I may as well put on some spices and make it taste good. But it's interesting that a person has to spend so much time of their life eating and planning for eating. It just takes up a big chunk of life. So why does that? Why is it that most of our life we're either eating or thinking about eating or working so we can eat? From the Kabbalistic perspective, eating is a spiritual activity because it basically is that's the process through which the human being could refine all aspects of the world, all the physical world around himself. That's why the Talmud says, I was mentioning, the Talmud says that they had it, that in the temple. Now, what happens in the temple? Temple is the same thing. It's just a visual. You're taking an animal, you're bringing it on the altar. The altar is a fire that goes up in smoke. That's just a visual how the physical can be elevated to God. But the Talmud says now that we don't have a temple and we don't have an altar, a person in the temple, the altar, there's that would atone for the person. So the Talmud says now that we don't have a temple, the person's table atones for the person. In other words, when you're sitting at your dining room table, that has in some ways the same holiness as the temple, as the altar in the temple, because in some ways, from the Kabbalistic perspective, it's serving the same function. What is the altar? The altar is where the animals would be offered and grains would be offered. That represents the elevation of the material world to God. But we do it. Every person does it in their own home when they eat, because that's what you're doing. You're elevating the physical and bringing it up to holiness. So that's the spiritual process of eating, which is a big deal in Kabbalistic and Hasidic life. It's also very, very modern in the sense that you have to be mindful when you eat. So this is being mindful not just of the food, but also being mindful of the spark that's in the food. Okay. But then when the other side of that token is that if that piece of food is able to sustain me, then in its source, it's greater than me. Because if it could sustain me, it has to be greater than me. So in the Kabbalah, everything is almost upside down. There's a hierarchy in this world where human being is higher than animal, which is higher than vegetable, which is higher than mineral. But in the Kabbalah, very often it's a flip. In the Kabbalah, very often it's a flip where something that's lower in this world has a higher source in the higher world. So, in other words, there's an advantage, something that's lower here, it's because in its source, not because it reflects the fact that it has a higher source. So, in some ways, when I'm eating the vegetable and when I'm eating the animal, what's happening to me is I am being elevated. I'm elevating it to its source, but in its source, it's higher than me, so it contributes to me. So, are we giving to the food we eat or are receiving from the food we eat? The answer is, of course, as usual, it's both. Okay, so that's the process of eating. Now, it also depends what I eat, because what I eat is going to affect what I'm getting from the food. And specifically, there are certain types of foods that are a little bit more tricky than others. And one example would be consumption of meat, which in America, the meat is the staple. But in biblical times, the meat is almost like a treat. The staple was bread, and meat was sort of was almost like the dessert. They would eat a little bit of meat. So the Talmud has an interesting statement. The Talmud says, Am ha'aretz, someone who's an ignoramus, someone who's not spiritually developed, is not allowed to eat meat. Why not? Because what do we say? You say you eat meat, you eat food, you're supposed to elevate the food. The problem is that there are certain types of food that it's harder to elevate. And it's possible that instead of me elevating the food's going to pull me down. And then it's better off that I don't eat it. Um, if somebody is spiritually refined, they could eat the meat and they could elevate the meat. But meat is something that's more difficult to elevate than let's say a grain or a vegetation. What is really happening here from the perspective of the Kabbalah? What's really happening here is like this. The real issue here is that the meat, the Kabbalah says meat is from gvura, from strength. So you have chesed, you have kindness, and gvura is strength. And strength is could be different things, but it could be discipline, it could be harsh. In this context, it's passion. Because on the right side, chesed is more like kindness and humility. Because kindness, there's different forms of kindness, but usually kindness is motivated by humility. Why am I performing kindness to the other person? It could come from arrogance, that's true. But in holiness, like Abraham says, Abraham is the symbol of a kind person, and Abraham says, Anochi afar ve'efar, I am sand and I am earth and dust. In other words, kindness could come from a place where I feel that everybody else is more deserving than me. So if I have something, I'm going to share it. So there could be kindness that comes from arrogance, but we're putting that aside. So kindness is synonymous in this context. Kindness is synonymous with humility, and the strength and the passion is synonymous with the sense, feeling the sense of self, feeling the ego, and even feeling the inflated ego. In other words, whatever it would be, it's I feel the self. So I'm passionate about whatever I'm passionate about because I feel myself and I want, and I'm in it for myself. So now the question is, meat represents that. When a person would eat the meat, you feel what it brings out within the person, or at least from the Kabbalistic perspective, at least what the source of the meat is, it doesn't make you more humble. In fact, it will make you, it speaks to the more animalistic sides of self, and therefore it can bring out more of the selfish ego and passion that is latent within the person. Now the question is that good or bad? So the answer is, of course, it could be good. So if a person is spiritually refined, a person could take the meat and eat the meat, and that represents internalizing passion. And then with that passion, you can use that passion to service of God. It's a wonderful thing. That's what the sacrifice is represented. And a person can also do it. If a person eats the meat, and that increases the passion, and now I can use that passion for a holy purpose. But you understand that if a person is not able to channel that passion for a holy purpose, then the passion could be self-destructive. It could be directed to negativity. You can also be directed towards self-destruction. Because if the passion is not channeled, it could lead to temptation, it could lead to indulgence, and ultimately to self-destruction. So that's what we're talking about. That's the challenge of eating meat, but also the opportunity of eating meat. So when it was done in the temple, it's not the person's own passion. It represents the idea that we elevate the physical phenomenon. We also elevate the more animalistic sides of the world and the sense of passion, and we could direct that to love God. Because remember, what's love of God? All love ultimately comes from passion. It's I want to be close to God. There's the I, and the more you feel the I, the more you feel what I want. So the point here is that there is a place for passion, and there is a place for passion, but it's passion that has to be channeled and elevated to the right place. And that's if it could be done. Not everyone can do it, and that's why the Talmud is cautious about doesn't say you can't eat meat, you're allowed to eat meat, but understand that the meat is there's a challenge because, and by the way, you can translate that to the physical world. Everything is like that. I can drive a car that makes me feel more proud, and I could drive a car that makes me feel less proud. So if I'm driving a car or buying a yacht or buying an airplane that makes me feel more proud, that's no problem. Makes me feel more sense of self. Okay, so now I can dedicate that sense of self, that passion, and dedicate it to holiness. But that's a spiritual challenge. In other words, it's easier. It's more work. So a person has to be up for that work. So that's what we're talking about. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. In that regard, does Moshe feel that people are not ready to elevate the meat, and people kind of think that they are ready?
Oh, so Moshe, we're going to get to that. You're jumping ahead. Not only is Moshe not think that the other people are ready, Moshe doesn't understand this whole concept. Moshe is complete humility. He doesn't relate to the idea that the passion and the sense of self could be transformed to the service of God. For that, you need Aaron. For that, you need the priests. Moshe says, "Ma'ayin li basar." I don't talk this language. Moshe wouldn't understand what you're saying. Moshe, the Torah says in this week's parsha, toward the end, "Vayish Moshe anav ma'od." Moshe is the most humble of men. In the Kabbalah, Moshe is chachma, which is synonymous with humility. Moshe does not sense a sense of self. So now the Kabbalah says, you come to Moshe and you say you want meat. He doesn't know what you're talking about. He doesn't understand it. It's a breakdown. It's a complete breakdown. For him, the sense of self and the sense of humility and the sense of spirituality cannot coexist. Not because he's a bad guy. That's just his spiritual state. That's the level of chachma. But then you have to step down. You have to see if I can apply the chachma to real life. And then maybe you have Aaron, and Aaron is a combination. We'll see how Aaron is a combination. And then you have the priests, and then you have the 70 people, and then everybody could have a little bit of Moshe. But yes, you put your finger on the problem here. Moshe is not in the business of saying, I want to feel the self. Just a very simple thing. I love God. Moshe won't even say I love God, because I love God it starts with the I. All love, in a way, starts with the I. It starts with this feeling, a sense of self, and I'm interested in what's good for me. For someone like Moshe, real humility is not the focus on self, it's the focus on what is greater than self. When Moshe stands before God, he doesn't feel himself. He feels himself insignificant compared to the infinity of God. It's not I love God. I am irrelevant. That's Moshe. Now, when Moshe comes and starts talking about meat, forget it, physical meat for sure. But even if they say we want to feel passion, we want to feel that we love God, for Moshe, he cannot handle that. Now, I'm not saying Moshe is right or Aaron is right. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's the problem here. So now you brought us back to where we need to be, which is now we can come back to the story and say, when the people come to Moshe and they say, we want meat. And even before we want meat, there's a very beautiful Hasidic interpretation. It says the people in Hebrew, sometimes things are doubled when you want to emphasize it. It says something twice. So, for example, in this week's parsha, it says the people who the people were there, they craved the craving. So say crave the craving sounds like it's a strong craving. But the Hasidic interpretation is the people were at Sinai. At Sinai, you don't sense of self. You sense the presence of God. They say, we want to crave. They didn't crave the meat. They wanted to crave the meat. They wanted to sense the self. They wanted to feel myself. I want to feel that I love something. And even if I love something negative, I love meat. But then once I sense my own craving, now I could direct that and cultivate a sense of love to God. But Moshe, that's not Moshe's thing. Moshe's thing is in a way, the absence of self, the humility, the sensing of something greater than self. So that's what's happening here. That's the clash that's happening between the Moshe, who is telling us, who lives a life where it's not about myself, to the people who say, we want a craving. We want a craving. What does that mean? I'm sure some people wanted the steak, but some people wanted the process of enjoying the steak. And why do they want to enjoy the steak? So then we could sense the self. Now we could apply that to the service of God and say, I love God. I love God. I want to love God, but I want to feel a self. Now to Moshe, that's the antithesis. The I and closeness to God cannot coexist. But it could. If you're not, it could, because Moshe's level could be applied to other levels, and that's what we're going to try to get to. So the Kabbalah gets very interested because Moshe says, where do I have meat from? Now Moshe doesn't understand God could bring miracles. He could bring some wind and bring some birds in here. What's the big deal? Moshe says, Ma'ayin li basar. I'm ayin. I'm nothing. I don't have meat. I'm the level of ayin. I'm nothingness. I don't sense the self. I cannot communicate with meat. Meat represents the passion of feeling the pleasure. What does God say after that? God says, Hayad Hashem Titzar, is the hand of God short, meaning is anything impossible for God? So Moshe says that the connection to God and the sense of humility before God cannot coexist with meat. And God says anything is possible. You could take that level of awareness that you have, that Moshe has, what the Kabbalah would call chachma, the wisdom, which is the openness to what is greater than self, and you could experience that simultaneously while experiencing the self. And in a way, the Kabbalah talks about this, that the opening phrase of this parsha is the lighting of the menorah, which is a very strange thing because it's the third time the Torah is telling us about the menorah. It's the third time. So why is it telling us about the menorah? Why is it reiterating it? There's all kinds of reasons given. So I'm not going to get into all those reasons, but in a way, the visual of oil, the menorah is oil. Oil in the Kabbalah is brings light, enlightenment. So oil is humility. It's a enlightenment, and enlightenment is humility, because enlightenment means sensing what is greater than self in the Kabbalah. But oil also has a wick, and the wick is the body, wick is the person, wick is the ego. And the oil allows for the fire and the wick to coexist to the point where there's a flame. And a flame means it surges upward, but it also comes back down. There's a constant tug between trying to transcend and coming back. So the visual of the oil is here you have chachma, you have humility, you have wisdom, and that wisdom is flaming and connected to the person's own sense of self. So Aaron is a sort of a step, quote unquote, a step down from Moshe, because Aaron lights the menorah, but Moshe is complete humility. Aaron is saying, can you apply the humility, which humility is a code word. Humility means the sense of something greater than self that makes you forget about yourself. Could you apply that and connect that to the wick, to your own life? And that's what Aaron represents. And Moshe himself, in this case, has to lower himself. God says, I'm going to take the spirit that's on you and bring it lower to the 70 people, representing how we could take that idea and bring it down. And then it gets everything in the Kabbalah has to be precise. So these birds, they're fatty birds. What is fatty birds? Again, shemen, fat, oil. In Hebrew, it's almost the same word. So the fat comes from oil, but the word for fat is oil. So that represents here you have the paradox where something is meat, but it also has oil. It's meat, it has a sense of self, but it also has the humility. And the result is that the meat that God gives is meat that's associated with humility. What does that mean? What's a practical example of someone who says, I feel the self, I feel passion, but it's also humble. It's also not about me. How could you feel passion and still not be about me? So there's different applications, of course, but one application is what this discourse that I'm reading said, Rabbi Zalman says. One application is as follows: somebody thirsts for God. And Moshe doesn't thirst for God. Remember, Moshe is not fire. Fire is drawing upward. I feel distant. I want to come close. Moshe is complete humility. It's not about me. It's not about if I thirst, I don't thirst. It's only about God. So Moshe doesn't thirst for God. Aaron thirsts for God. The person thirsts for God. There's two ways to say it. So I have a passionate love to God. Why do I have a passionate love to God? It could be only about the self, because this is what I want. And that's the critique of love that every love returns to the lover. I say, I love you so much. What I'm really saying is I love myself. I love myself, and therefore I want to be close to you because of what you do for me. So that's the idea of the meat and the love and the sense of self and the sense of passion that's completely divorced from the idea of the humility. But if I say I'm passionate and I want to have a relationship with you, but it's not just to quench my own thirst. It's not just because this is what I want, but it's for your benefit and for our benefit, or in the case of God, for the benefit of the world. I want to have a relationship with God because I want to bring God into this world. Then you have it both ways. You have both. You have the fatty meat. You have the meat, but you have the humility. I want to feel passion. I want to feel connection to God. I want to feel how myself is inspired. The ego is inspired, but it's not all about myself. The purpose then would be also for things that transcend self. So that would be the ramification. I'm in love with somebody, but then you can ask, is it only about the love? Is it only about the self? Or is there also a sense of transcendence? And they'll be very clear. If you're not sure, ask the spouse. Ask the spouse if the love is all self-love, or there's also self-love connected with chachma, connected with humility, connected with transcendence. And that's the tension here. And that's what we do every day. Because every day what we're trying to do is be like the people eating the meat, because when you eat, you elevate. But elevation also, it goes both ways. I have to elevate it. I interact with it. If I interact with it, then it depends. It can also pull me down. It could also make me. It could also get me more in touch with the passion and ego side of self, and that itself could be elevated and should be elevated. But that's a tension, and it's never perfect, because remember, we're in the second half of the fourth book, which is the real world application to the real world, which is always more complicated than the first half of the book, where it's all theoretical. And that's the beauty, because the beauty is not being in the theoretical, not being in the chachma, not being only in the state of humility where my sense of self doesn't matter, but it's the negotiation between the sense of self and the wisdom and the enlightenment. And in the words of the Kabbalah, chachma and bina, or meat and oil, or the wick and the candle, use whatever metaphor you like and whichever metaphor speaks to you. So that's the story in short. Maybe we'll stop a few minutes early today, but I would love to hear any comments or questions, because um, I always get enhanced from the interaction. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. So, are we to assume that they're both right? That
Yes.
one is wrong? That this is really a teaching moment more for Moshe than it is for the people?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
God tells Moshe, Hayad Hashem Tiktzar, you think that there's something is impossible for God? It's impossible for God to bring meat to the people. On the surface is a very big problem. How does Moshe think that God can't provide meat? He provides manna, and people say the Medrash in fact says that this is actually a bigger sin that what ultimately brought down what ultimately was the sin of Moshe, which he wasn't allowed to go into the land of Israel because he hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock and because and the Torah refers to that as a lack of faith. So the Medrash says this is a much bigger lack of faith. He tells God, how he says there's 600,000 people here. How can I give them meat? How can you give them meat? So the Medrash seems to say this is a lack of faith on Moshe's part. So the Medrash says the reason why Moshe wasn't punished for it was because it wasn't in public. If it wasn't in public, so it didn't cause damage to others. But so it's clear that this story is where Moshe, it's hard to understand on a simple level. How come Moshe doesn't think that God could perform a miracle? But clearly Moshe needs to understand that God is all powerful and can do anything. But from the Kabbalistic perspective, it makes a lot more sense. Moshe does not understand how you can be both spiritual, have chachma, have enlightenment, have spirit, have transcendence, while you're eating a piece of steak and feeling the passion of the physical world. How can you have those two together? To Moshe, it's impossible. And God says, take a deep breath. And he says, God can do anything. Of course, Chachma can come down. The whole purpose of Chachma is to descend. Because to stay in the realm of the abstract, we could stay at Sinai. We don't have to travel to the desert. So yes, when you travel to the desert, it's more messy and it's more complicated. And you take a step back and it may take 40 years. But in a way, that's the goal. The goal is that the wick should be illuminated. The goal is that the passion should be directed toward the love of God. And there should be an interaction between the spiritual and the physical, and they should enhance each other. That's part of the idea of eating. When I eat, I elevate the food, but the food affects me. So the physical passion actually, in some ways, enhances the spiritual. Because the person who's humble, very nice. It's not about you, but where's your passion? Are you going to work to make the world a better place with that same passion as the person who is motivated and ambitious to expand the self? So we need to take the animalistic side of self and marry it to the chachma, to the wisdom, to the spiritual enlightenment. But the short answer is to your question is yes, a lot of this is about Moshe. A lot of this is Moshe processing this and Moshe thinking it's possible to have this combination, and God saying, take it easy. It's not, it could be done. God could do this. Don't be
So
afraid.
elevating this to 30,000 feet, why is it so? I mean, reading this on face value, this is very much a story of the people screwed up. He has a mental breakdown and he's revived.
Yeah,
If this is really more about at 30,000 feet, you see this guy Moshe that you think is perfect, he ain't. And
right.
he's got a lot more to think about. And
I,
none of us are perfect. And it's a journey in the right direction.
I'll say what you said, but I'll say it a little bit different. First of all, you're right. A lot of this parsha, if you look carefully, God is not upset at the people. Moshe is.
Right.
For example, in the beginning it says the people complained. His be'enei Moshe ra. In the eyes of Moshe, it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't say in the eyes of God it's bad. When God is upset, we hear about it loud and clear, right? And here also, God also gets upset at some point when they ask for too much meat. He also punishes the people because remember, some people want meat because they're in truth not interested. So I don't want to generalize too much, but there's no question a lot of this is about Moshe. Now you said Moshe is imperfect. I would say it a little bit differently. I would say Moshe is too perfect. In other words, Moshe is in the realm of perfection. He's chachma. He's in the abstract. In the abstract, you could live in the perfect world. The whole point of the second half of the book is the perfect world is not interesting. It's clean. It's not messy, but it's not real. It's too abstract. So it's angelic. So it's not that Moshe's problem is that he's not perfect. Is the problem is that he's too perfect. And in a way, the arena where the purpose of creation happens is when you step down from Moshe and you bring it down to other people in a way. When you read the Rashi, there's an interesting word, "Ve'atzalti b'norak." I'll take from the spirit that's upon you and put it upon them. And the word "ve'atzalti" is a tricky word. It's the same word that we use for atzilut, emanation. It's a tricky word. It's basically lowering but not diluting the product. And the Medrash says, what does Moshe look like at that point? The Medrash says it's like Moshe is like a candle that's on a menorah. Keep going back to the metaphor of the menorah. And all 70 people approach and they could take their light from Moshe's light. So that's the paradox. In other words, we're taking Moshe's perfection, but we're not leaving it just stuck on the menorah. Everybody can come and take from that light and apply it to their life. And that's where the story is going, and that's where the history is going. And in a way, it's a step down from perfection, but that's the superficial way of looking at it. That unfortunately everything is falling apart. The Kabbalistic way of looking at it, because now we're doing something much more profound. We're taking from the realm of just chachma, just abstract wisdom, and what we're saying is, could you apply that to the gvura? Could you apply that to the passion? Could you apply that to the meat? That's the real world, and the real world is always going to be more challenging and more difficult and more messy. But that's ultimately the purpose.
Yeah, but for the Benini, for the person reading this, wouldn't it have been more smarter to have God's wrath to Moshe more obvious, and this be the reason he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael, than hitting the rock, which
Yeah,
everybody says, oh yeah, that incurred the wrath of God.
so maybe this is the story. In other words, it's a cryptic story because at the end there's Eldad and Medad, the two people who are prophesizing, and Joshua wants to imprison them, and Moshe says, "Don't imprison them."
Right.
Why is Joshua so offended? Because the Medrash says that what do those two prophesize? They prophesy. They say Moshe is going to die, and Joshua is going to bring the people into the land of Israel. In other
Mhm.
words, what the Medrash is really saying is that yes, this story is the beginning of the fact that Moshe can't go into Israel. And maybe the hitting of the rock is just the final straw, whatever they call it, whatever the final step
Yeah.
of that process. But you're right. You're saying in some ways this represents the fact that Moshe, in a way, is too abstract and too perfect to be able to. Too perfect is the wrong word. Is too in the world of ideas to be able to lead the people into the land of Israel. And maybe this is the first time we see it. And that's why as soon as they start moving, this flares up because this is a real problem. And then the practical side, in other words, the full expression of that incompatibility happens when he hits the rock. But those seeds of that story happen right here, and that's why the Medrash says, how does the Medrash get it out of his hat that they prophesize that Moshe is going to die? Because what the Medrash is sensing is this is a breakdown. This is a real breakdown. Moshe is not able to communicate with the people, and Moshe
Mhm.
himself says, "Kill me." Right? You see, there's a very deep incompatibility here. And you could look at it and say Moshe is not good, but the Kabbalah says no, Moshe is Chachma. The problem is that Chachma doesn't realize that because it's so serene and perfect, it doesn't realize that it could go and quote unquote get its feet dirty and get involved in real life and still maintain the holiness. If you see what I'm saying.
But yeah, I do. And to your former teachings, didn't the people have the same lack of faith in mixing it up? Because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
wasn't for the Miraglim and all.
yeah.
Wasn't it that they want to stay in the desert and just study Torah their whole life and not get their hands dirty?
100%. This is much harder. Balance is always harder than being one extreme. It's very easy to be spiritual. It's very easy to be materialistic.
Right.
To do both is very difficult, and it's a challenge, and it's going to take some time, and you're going to have to work it out. So Moshe expresses this challenge from one angle, and the spies next week will see how the people process to this challenge, right? But even before you deal with how the people deal with it, you're going to see Moshe himself cannot handle it. Moshe says people want meat. What are we talking about? Aren't we all humble? Aren't we all altruistic? Aren't we
Right.
all in it for the greater good? The answer is yes, but there's also real life, and you have to marry that with real life.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Darabah. Thank you, Bob. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a beautiful class, but all through the class, I was trying to think about how would we apply it for our today's life. We are not so united these days, right? And we don't have Moses' presence, and we also don't have God's interactions.
Right.
So
But we're still dealing with the same idea. Could a person,
I just want to finish my point.
yeah, go ahead.
When we consume meat, right? When
Yeah.
individual consumes meat without actually realizing what it does to his spiritual state and the ideas and stuff, it can pull the person in different directions.
Yes.
How does it affect the person, the people around the person, and the society as a whole?
I 100% agree. That's the tension. The tension is we have to elevate the world, but elevating the world means that we're interacting, and interacting means a dance, and in a dance it could pull you down. So 100%. The more you have, the first step is the awareness to realize that it could go either way. And when we engage with materialism or eating meat, but that could be a metaphor for other things as well. It could bring us more egotistical, or we could be elevating it. And it is a challenge, and it does take time, and it's not so simple. And that's how this teaching applies to us, because we're negotiating this every single day. How much do we sense the sense of self, and how much do we sense the sense of climbing out of ourselves and connecting to something greater than us? And the answer is we need both. We have to cultivate the sense of I love God. Love the Lord your God is a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah that incorporates self. As opposed to the first sentence of the Shema, there's no I love God. In the first sentence of Shema, what the Kabbalah refers to higher unity, Yichud Eilah, it's God is one. God is one means nothing else exists. But then you can't just stay in that world, because then you're at the level of Chachma. Then you have to come down to Yichud Tata, to the lower level of unity, where I exist. And now where I exist, now I love God. Now I'm merging Chachma and Bina, or now I'm merging the Chesed and the Gevura. So every person is going to deal with this on their level in every area of life.
Beautiful. That's the challenge. That's the beauty.
Yeah.
That every person needs to go
through.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love you. How much of it is for me and how much of it is for you? Right? Now you have to have a little bit of both. Right? So yeah. So that's the teaching. Okay.
Thank you. Shabbat
Wonderful
shalom.
Shabbat. Thank you for joining. Be well. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye bye.
Thank you.